Good morning and welcome to this, the last in our series called Rebuild. So far in the series we've been looking at the book of Ezra, and following on both in the Bible and in historical time from Ezra is the book of Nehemiah. Both books are named after their authors and are accounts of their activities, and as we'll see they were co-workers in the rebuilding of Jerusalem, each with a different role but both moving in God's love, in his compassion and in his plan. The book of Nehemiah is an historical account, and some bits may have been taken from his reports to the king. That was Artaxerxes at the time. But much could also be his personal diary. Today we'll only gloss over most of the book in the time that we have, but I want to encourage you to give it a deeper read sometime, perhaps with the help of a good study book. This is the one I like to use. So this is the message of Nehemiah, and it comes from the Bible Speaks Today series. That's a series of books going through the whole Bible, giving you deeper study. But I want to read this first of all from the introduction to this book in the Bible and in the Message version. So Nehemiah started out as a government worker in the employ of a foreign king. Then he became a building contractor, called in to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. His co-worker Ezra was a scholar and a teacher working with the scriptures. Nehemiah worked with stones and mortar. The stories of the two men are interwoven in the seamless fabric of a vocational holiness. Neither job was more or less important or holy than the other. Nehemiah needed Ezra, and Ezra needed Nehemiah. God's people needed the work of both of them, and we still do. So Nehemiah then was a highly organised man. He was a gifted and inspirational leader. He was a manager, a team player working with Ezra. And Ezra brought in the teaching side and re-established the law. As well as an historical account of great accuracy, giving us an insight into life at the time, there's Nehemiah's cry to God and his readiness to do all that he can for the people and for the Lord, not counting any personal cost. Then there is the spiritual picture painted by the book, a picture of restoration work in the physical, which we can apply to the work of salvation and restoration done within the believer when he turns to Jesus. But for this series we'll focus on two aspects of the restoration: the city walls and re-establishing God's compassionate care for his people, and our personal responsibility in it. So let's turn to the word, shall we? And we're going to read from the Message, and it's Nehemiah chapter 1 through to chapter 2, verse 10. So these are the memoirs of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. It was the month of Kislev in the 20th year. At the time I was in the palace complex at Susa. Hanani, one of my brothers, had just arrived from Judah with some fellow Jews, and I asked them about the conditions there, conditions amongst the Jews who had survived the exile and about Jerusalem. They told me the exile survivors who are left there in the province are in a bad shape. Conditions are appalling. The wall of Jerusalem is still rubble. The city gates are still cinders. When I heard this, I sat down and I wept. I mourned for days, fasting and praying before God of heaven. I said, God of heaven, the great and awesome God, loyal to his covenant and faithful to those who love him and obey his commands, look at me, listen to me. Pay attention to this prayer of your servant that I'm praying day and night in intercession for your servants, the people of Israel, confessing the sins of the people of Israel. And I'm including myself. I and my ancestors were among those who sinned against you. We've treated you like dirt. We haven't done what you've told us to do. We haven't followed your commands and haven't respected the decisions that you gave Moses, your servant. All the same, remember the warning you posted to your servant Moses. If you betray me, I'll scatter you to the four winds. But if you come back to me and do what I tell you, I'll gather up all those scattered peoples from wherever they ended up and put them back in the place I chose to mark with my name. Well, there they are, your servants, your people whom you so powerfully and impressively redeemed. O Master, listen to me. Listen to your servant's prayer. And yes, to all your servants who delight in honouring you, and make me successful today so that I get what I want from the king. I was cupbearer to the king. And it was the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king. At the hour for serving wine, I brought it in and gave it to the king. I'd never been hangdog in his presence before, so he asked me, why the long face? You're not sick, are you? Are you depressed? That made me all the more agitated, and I said, long live the king. And why shouldn't I be depressed when the city where all my family is buried, is in ruins, and the city gates have been reduced to cinders? Then the king asked me, so what do you want? Praying under my breath to the God of heaven, I said, if it please the king, and if the king thinks well of me, send me to Judah, to the city where my family is buried, so that I can rebuild it. The king, and the queen sitting alongside him, said, how long will your work take, and when would you expect to return? I gave him a time, and the king gave his approval to send me. Then I said, if it please the king, provide me with letters to the governors across the Euphrates that authorise my travel through Judah, and also an order to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, to supply me with timber for the beams of the temple fortress, the wall of the city, and the house where I'll be living. The generous hand of my God was with me in this, and the king gave them to me. When I met the governors across the river, that's the Euphrates, I showed them the king's letters. The king even sent along a cavalry escort. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very upset and angry that anyone would come to look after the interests of the people of Israel. Okay, let's start then with a quick survey of Nehemiah, shall we? And here's the overall message. It's that the sacred and the secular are both equally important. The temple was rebuilt, but the community of people was in a mess. They were still not living by God's laws, and the poor were being ignored. Last time I spoke about the neglect they'd shown God's house while taking care of their own. In Nehemiah, it's gone the other way. Now is the time to rebuild the nation, not just the temple. Chapters 1 to 8 of this book, roughly the first half, deal with the rebuilding of the walls, who was involved, and how they assembled the gates and followed the reading of the law. Chapters 9 to 12, the kind of latter part, we see Israel reminded of their history with the Lord, and detailed lists of the people of the covenant, a census, a membership list if you like. They knew who they were in God and also as a community. And then in chapter 13 there are final reforms to build the nation. But we're going to take a closer look at that first half. And in chapters 1 to 2, we've just read most of that, Nehemiah hears that things are not going well in Jerusalem. The people are in trouble and shame, and the walls are broken down. His response is compassionate and desperate, and he fasted and prayed for days. And then he approaches the king, King Artaxerxes. He has access to him because he's a cupbearer to the king. He is given permission to go and see what's needed, but not for long. They want to know when he's back. On his arrival, he checks out the situation privately and in person. He doesn't want to hear the usual answer of, oh, we're fine, it's okay. He wants the real picture of what's going on. Likewise, I guess, we need to go out into the real world to be effective. We need to see what the situation is on the ground, on the street as it were, rather than from some lofty position. Well, Nehemiah then speaks to the leadership. That's the Jews, the priests, the nobles, and the officials. And he tells them the picture and how God has sent him with the king's support. In summary, they rise up to the job and get on with it. Well, most of them do, as we'll hear later. And in chapter 3, this is where we focus on the rebuild. And all of the people who do the work are listed here. That might originally have been part of Nehemiah's report back to the king, but it was included in his memoirs. They worked on specific parts of the wall around the gates. A detailed study of the restoration of these gates and the order and the symbology of each one reveals a deeper spiritual picture of the progressive restoration of our lives once the King comes to live inside, but that's for another series maybe. And we can note from this chapter as well that some of the so-called important people wouldn't help out. Chapter 3 verse 5 tells us that. It says, but their nobles would not stoop to serve the Lord. I wonder if their leaders ever cleaned toilets. So what are the important points from all of this? Well, do note when you read through that they work near their homes, in their neighbourhood, places and areas for which they have a natural concern. We all, as individuals, naturally have the deepest concern maybe for our patch, and whether that's a physical place like your street or your town, or a field of ministry such as poverty like Make Lunch and the food bank, or public safety like with town pastors. Those are just a couple of the things that we've felt have been our patch, both individually and as a church. So they work near their homes, the gates that are near to them, and who wouldn't want to see that things nearby are in good order? But they also use their individual skills. Those skills are listed and defined for each person. They use the gifts that God has given them. And as we read on, we hear a little bit more about what Nehemiah does personally as well. Because it's not just about rebuilding walls and rebuilding gates, it's about rebuilding society and rebuilding community. And he's seen how they're suffering and how the poor aren't getting the food that they need, that they should under the law. And so using his own money, he looks after them and supports the poor. And he even buys back Hebrew slaves. We can see that in chapter 5. This paints a picture of Nehemiah as someone who brings a personal sacrifice and personal giving into serving the Lord. And he does this in private. I wonder how many people at the time thought he was using taxes and money from the king to do that. And so in that way, Nehemiah gives us an excellent example of the Christian lifestyle and two key principles. First of all, as we see in Nehemiah 5 verse 15, is his reverence for God. Nehemiah's first consideration in all that he did, even before what was best for himself, was to understand what was pleasing to God. 5:15 says that the governors who had preceded me had oppressed the people by taxing them 40 shekels of silver, that's about £1 a day, for food and wine, while their underlings bullied the people unmercifully. But out of fear, that is translated reverence in other Bibles, out of reverence of God, I did none of that. And so reverence for God is the first key principle of the Christian life, and it's how Nehemiah served his God. The second is this, compassion for others. And that follows on in chapter 5 in verses 17 and 18, because Nehemiah wasn't like so many of those leaders, exacting large payments from the local people to meet his hospitality expenses, but he fed officials and visitors out of his own salary. It says here in verses 17 to 18, I fed 150 Jews and officials at my table, in addition to those who showed up from the surrounding nations. 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, and some chickens were prepared for me daily, and every 10 days a larger supply of wine was delivered. Even so, I didn't use the food allowance provided for the governor. The people had it hard enough as it was. And so Nehemiah oversees the completion of the work on the wall, despite continued opposition. And we heard a bit of that in our reading, and that continues through chapter 6. And to summarise what happens, there's a plot to kidnap him in verses 1 to 4, to malign him, to badmouth him in verses 5 to 9, to intimidate him in verses 10 to 14, and also to undermine him in verses 15 to 19. Kidnap probably isn't anything we experience, but being maligned and intimidated and undermined is something we might experience, the kind of oppositions we might see in our life. In particular, the subtlety with which the enemy attacks is something that we might see in our workplaces or maybe in our neighbourhood. If that's something that you've experienced, take a careful read of chapter 6 and be assured, as Nehemiah was, that the Lord is sufficient for every challenge that you face. And so moving on, in chapter 7, everyone is identified and accounted for, and their gifts are tabulated. And as we reach the end of this section, we see that the enemies are silenced. They've tried their very best, but each time they try something, Nehemiah is there relying on God. And if you read how they're rebuilding with their trowels, with mortar in one hand and their swords in the other. That's a picture for us. When we're rebuilding, when we're working out in the community, when we're building church, remember, yes, we've got a job to do, and that job is symbolised by the trowel, the mortar which we're putting in between the bricks in building. But in our other hand is our sword. And for us in the New Testament, we know the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. We need both of those things. See again how the secular and the spiritual is kept together in this book of Nehemiah. But what's the application to this in our lives? Well, like Nehemiah maybe, we need to rebuild near our homes. And as we rebuild, is each of us ready to hear from God what we might be doing? Will we see the broken walls on our doorstep, and will we respond with compassion, with vision, and with energy? Are there any jobs which we might feel are beneath us, like the important people who didn't get involved with that building work? Are we content to sit on the sidelines and watch? Well, I very much hope not. And like the people in Nehemiah's time, we need to use our skills. You know, he didn't try to squeeze round pegs into square holes. Each of them used the gift and talents that they had. So I might ask, what are mine? Do I have all I need for the job? Or do I need to go out and buy some tools, or maybe get trained in their use? Do I have some dormant skills that, as we rebuild, can be put to work where they weren't being needed before? But most of all, am I prepared to ask God where I might be used and then get on with it? I might ask the Lord in prayer, but who else might I ask? Who else might I turn to for guidance to show me where I'm needed and where my effort is most wanted? So what is the Lord saying to me, and how will I get that moving, and who will I talk to is such an important thing as we rebuild, as we look to what the church is going to be, both as a church in the days to come in 2021, but also in our community, both having that spiritual dimension and that worship of God embodied in all that we do, but then also that secular dimension of work and servanthood out into our communities. But don't forget that all of this needs to be underlined with one further thing, and that's a personal compassion that comes from the very heart of God. You know, I said 2 weeks ago about building up treasures in heaven and not at home. As Jesus said, where your treasure is, there is your heart also. So where am I investing? Nehemiah wasn't content to see others in need, in poverty even, without responding from his own pocket. I wonder, how secure do I feel? How secure do we all feel in God's promise to provide and care for us, that we can reach out freely and use all the resources that we have to help those around us? Hopefully, when God calls us to work, our first thought isn't who will pay for it, but how can I help meet this need? Now, I say this against a backdrop of some wonderful hard work and giving from many in the fellowship into the food parcel scheme all through lockdown. Giving of time, of talents, and of money. And you know, you may not have had and may not have now all three to spare, and yet a careful check of our budgets for each might help us release more into God's work. And yes, you can budget your time and your talents, just as you can budget your money. Why not give that a try? Where are you putting your time? Where are you putting your talents? And where are you investing with your money too? Because we all have a part. Ezra and Nehemiah epitomize this. They had different roles, but they dovetail together as a partnership of God, a partnership with God. Three of them, God, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Ezra represents the sacred, the rebuilding of the temple, and the restoration of the law. That's following God's ways. People's spiritual needs. Nehemiah represents the secular, the restoration of the city and its structures, and the care of people's physical needs. Neither could do it all, and neither was more important than the other. And without both together, there would be no resurgent Israel, no home for the coming Messiah to be born in. It's the same with us. Perhaps you're more suited to preaching or leading worship. Great. Perhaps you're more suited to prayer support. Fantastic. There's a place for you. But maybe you're more suited to physical needs, and you also have a place. You know, the person who cleans the church and maintains it and repairs it, they should be valued just as much as the one who teaches. And those who have apparent platform places shouldn't regard those doing other more menial jobs, if you like, as lesser. No, we're all part of the same body. So let's bring this to a summary, to a conclusion. We're thinking about rebuilding outside. We need to look around. In these days where change is happening, we need to see what is broken and what needs are there on our doorstep. We also need to know who are the workers and what are their roles. We also need to enable the spiritual and the secular to work together in our church and in our programs. As we look forward to 2021 here in Britain, even here in Newmarket, what are the new challenges that are going to result from this year that's been 2020? For all the things that are associated with COVID and all the difficulties that people have experienced, and where Newmarket is as a society and as a community. Where is the Lord calling us? Where is the Lord calling Newmarket Community Church? And where is the Lord calling me and you? Be assured that there is a place for God's people. If only we would share the anguish that Nehemiah had for the people of Israel when he heard of the desperate situation they were in. If only that would empower and fuel us as we look around our neighbourhood. Will we cry out to God for what he would have us do and then implement that through effort and personal sacrifice? So perhaps the question to ask then, bringing all of those things together, is where will we invest? Our time, our talents, and our treasure as well. Father God, you are supreme and you are sufficient. And wherever our society is right now, whatever is broken down in our communities, whatever's been rendered down to ash, you will restore. I just pray that as our nation continues to battle with COVID-19 and as people's lives are affected more and more deeply, let us, your church, bring light and hope. And let us be ready to meet needs and give practical help as well as that hope, to your glory and to the glory of your amazing, mighty name, Jesus. Amen.